Yang. War. It's an interesting concept. In war, life is but a number, one to add to an arbitrary total that exists outside the eventual outcome. You're not an individual. You're not a person. You're a number capable of adding or subtracting from that total. I've learned this after looking through countless records of Korea. You don't find the names of the men who fought to defend our country's rights. You see a number. 271,300. Nearly 300,000 lives lost to a conflict that never should have been. 227,800 dead. 43,500 MIA on the Korean side. Over 4 times the casualties of the Americans. I look at the MIA total often, a round number calculated to the nearest 100 for ease of effort. But how many men were left unaccounted for by that margin? Then I think back to the forest, those familiar faces along the trees, all tragically extinguished as they shone their brightest. And I can't help but insist that numbers should be 5 greater. I'm not trying to glorify my position in the war. I'm not trying to say we fought for what was right. But I will say I fought for my country, and I was proud to do it. I was only 20 then. I enlisted in the Korean People's Army of my own accord, despite the protest of my mother, whom I'd always hated for marrying the tyrant that was my father. But I won't be too personal here. I won't tell you how his existence impacted mine, how he used to beat me in front of his friends and laugh as they kicked dust in my mouth, how he used to soil my bed when he was drunk and rub my face in his excrement when I accidentally lay down in it, how he always forced me to sit in the corner of his bedroom, my legs tied together, as he pleasured my mother in front of me. I'm getting off track. In any case, he was the main reason I enlisted. I just needed to get away from all of it. I won't tell you about my training because every army does it the same, but I was deployed 7 months later. I belonged to the 2nd Division of the Ground Forces, the 14th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Section. You've never heard of it. It's because the UN had removed it from the history books after the war ended. Why? I don't know. Maybe they thought we weren't important enough to be recognized. Maybe they wanted to erase all the injustice done by North Korea. Or maybe it's because of what happened on our first mission in 1951. It was March, I recall. The bright emerald leaves were just starting to come out after the harsh winter the army had on the battlefield. Fury Squad. That's what we called ourselves. And there were 7 of us. Our sergeant was a man by the name of T. We didn't know his full name, and we never dared ask. He was a steel-cold man, that Hollywood stereotype of a battle-hardened hero. We feared him more than any monster and admired him more than any celebrity at the same time. He was a puzzle of a man, strict but understanding, at least during training. We knew only one thing about him, and it was that we knew nothing about him. Our sharpshooter was Hyun Wook, and he was always talkative and jovial while we were eating or having a group discussion. But when he was on the battlefield, I'd never seen a more focused nor reserved person in my life. Then there was Kyun, who was the youngest of the group, and we didn't know much about him other than his father forced him to enlist. I deeply emphasized with him and made sure to take him under my wing. Apparently he and Hyung Wook had known each other since elementary school. Seokyo and Seokyu were twins, only a year older than I was. I don't remember much about them. And lastly there was Tae. He was the sergeant's son. I often envied him for having such a noble father, one that treated him well and with respect instead of disdain. I expected him to brag and boast about his father's accomplishments, of which I was sure there were many, perhaps too many to count. but throughout our entire training and deployment, he never spoke a word to us or his father. After our first day in the field, we had suffered heavy losses on our side. Explosions were booming across the landscape, and bullets pelted the ground at our feet. Our battalion had at least 120 men, according to Hyun-wook. As we fired from the defenses, our hands calloused from clutching our T-99s, the sun began to lower below the horizon. Above the deafening crash of a mortar hitting our concrete reinforcements, I heard Sergeant Yi issued an order. "Break off. Fall back." We looked at each other confused. Why was Yi ordering us away from the defensive position? Our battalion needed all the help that they could get. And without hesitation, we lowered our rifles and grabbed our sacks. We didn't know what would happen if we disobeyed the sergeant, and none of us wanted to find out. "Let's go." We hopped over the concrete border of our point and began trudging through the slimy grass that layered the area, all except for Hyun-wook, who was still focused on sniping the enemy. "Come on, Hyun, let's go," I shouted over the hail of bullets coming from each direction. All of us, except for Yi and Tae, of course, had practiced English extensively to intercept American messages during training, to such an extent that we spoke it solely through habit, such as required of the youngest soldiers of the People's Army. Hyun-wook turned to look at us, ducking so the enemy's bullets would not hit him as he stepped away. Then 2 of the bullets went through his pelvis. I don't know how they penetrated the concrete, but they did. Hyun-wook collapsed backwards in a motion of searing pain, clutching his lower body, bright red blood oozing through his fingers. The rest of the Fury squad rushed to carry the wounded soldier. I grabbed his right arm, Sak-ho on his right leg and Sak-jo on his left. Tae stared forward in fear, gazing at the viscous red substance that was now pooling to the ground. "Tae, grab a stretcher," Sak-jo shouted. He stood there unflinching, and I expected Ji to stroll right up to him and smack him right in the face for disobeying, but he did nothing. He simply stood there, arms crossed, tapping his boot against the mud. We had to lay Hyun-wook down in the filthy ground so Sak-hyo could get the stretcher, and by the time he returned, he was in unbearable pain. I can't move my legs," he grunted. We opened up his shirt and saw 2 holes, one that went clean through the top center of his belly, hitting the spine, and another that had gotten lodged somewhere in his groin. We poured solution onto his exposed wounds and wrapped them in bandages. As we struggled to lift our wounded friend, Tae simply stood there. I shot him several pleading glances to get him to help, but he was too absorbed in his fear. Then Sergeant Ji did something I would never forget. He walked up to our group and pulled Sak-hyo aside, handing him his T-38. And then he told him to shoot Hyun-wook. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. There was a small part of me who wanted Sak-hyo to follow orders, to not upset the menacing presence that was Yi. But that part was overwhelmed by the part that he knew what a terrible act it was. Sir, I can't do this." With this remark, Yi's normally stern expression turned into a clear, pronounced frown. Enraged, he tore the carbine from Sak-hyo's nervous grasp and thrust it into his brother's hands, screaming the same awful command in his face. I expected Sak-hyo to refuse like his brother, but what happened next terrified me. He suddenly dropped his gaze and stared straight ahead, clutching the carbine. I could see that his white knuckles were on the verge of bleeding from the force. Yi moved out of the way of his stare, and for a moment he continued to look off in that direction. He didn't seem to be focusing on anything in particular. It was as if he was a statue, his eyes affixed to a natural position. Then he broke his line of sight with the nothingness and looked at his brother. He tilted his head sideways, almost like a dog, examining an intruder to judge whether it was a threat. Then he turned to look at his wounded colleague. He raised his gun and uttered a phrase of confirmation. "If you say so, sir." Even though I knew what was about to happen, I still couldn't believe my eyes when it occurred. Sok-jo pulled the trigger and sent 4 bullets through Yeon-wook's heart, and Sok-ho simply stared at the act, mouth agape, astonished at what his brother had just done. Sok-jo lowered the carbine and placed it in Sergeant G's waiting hands. With a blank expression on his face, G smiled as he acknowledged the act of obedience. I rushed over to the traumatized Gyeon, still not quite believing what I had seen, and as I lay cradling him, wishing he did not have to witness such a horrible act, I heard G proudly announce, "A soldier who cannot walk is a war that cannot be won." As we headed off into the wooded area, leaving our colleague unburied, the sun turned a deep shade of orange. I was able to get one last glimpse of it before it was covered by the black branches of the still bare trees. It was so vibrant that one could barely see the streaks of the mortars falling from the sky. We were forced to hike across the muddy landscape under Sergeant G's lead. His explanation for doing so, when we demanded it from him, was that we were setting up a long defense position to combat a supposed U.S. flanking movement. I was too furious at him and Sok-jo to speak. At one point, Ji told us to stop and make a fire. Kyung, Sok-jo, and I unpacked our bags to cook the tinned rations, while Sok-ho and Tae were gathering wood. Sergeant Ji said he would accompany them in order to make sure Tae got his share of the work done. With him gone, Geen and I were free to discuss what we'd seen. "What was that back there?" Geen asked, still incredulous. "I don't want to think about it ever again," I replied. Then we both turned and stared at our colleague, who was calmly unwrapping the tins of porridge. I realized putting the murder out of my mind would be impossible when in the company of the very person who committed the act. I hadn't felt so much anger for someone since I was home with my father. Just the thought of Hyun's death brought to mind thoughts of the many beatings he had incurred on me during my childhood. But I was unable to put my personal life out of my head and focus on the recent events. "What the fuck, Sok-jo?" I sputtered. "How could you do that? How could you shoot your own squad member? How could you do that? How?" He continued his task, not even caring enough to look at me. "Hey, you motherfucker, answer me. Why did you kill him?" He turned and looked at me with that same blank expression in his eyes I'd seen him when he committed the horrible act. And he simply said, "Because he told me to." And with that, he went back to his work. Somewhere in the distance, a bomb hit the earth, sending a crack throughout the forest. "I don't give a shit about what Ji said. You still killed your own damn friend." A fellow soldier. I was so busy screaming that I didn't notice that Geen had picked up one of the rocks we were piling and was now wielding it in his hand. And before I could react, Geen was upon him. The rock smashed violently into Sok-jo's jaw, instantly breaking it. I could hear the telltale crack of bone shattering as the rock went up and down and up and down and up and finally down, until there was nothing left but bone shards and blood. I pulled back Yin, who curled up in a fetal position and cried. I couldn't control myself," he whimpered. "It's just my father, he moaned in remorse. "It's just like what he did." "It's okay, Gian. It's okay." I hugged him, holding back his shaking arms. "My mother, She was always mistreated, always put up with it. One day she went behind his back and made love to the neighbor's husband. He sniffed, tears beginning to roll down his dirt-crusted cheeks. I was friends with his daughter. We were both shocked to find out. When my father found out, though, he didn't seem too affected. He wiped his nose, burying his head in his hands. He didn't seem too affected when he took a shotgun to my neighbors and my friend. He sobbed again. I was there to watch it, Zhang. I was playing in the yard when he just burst through the door and he leaned over and vomited, tears streaming down his cheeks. Seeing Hyun die reminded me of her. Just the senseless murder. I felt so much for him at that moment. I pictured my own father at home, abusing my mother. I knew he would never do such a thing. He was too cowardly. But all the mental torture he'd put me through, I wished that I had the courage to do the same to him. To just take a rock and pummel his head till his brains spewed out all over the ground. I don't want to fight this war, Zhang. He choked. Then he looked down at his blood-streaked hands and took in a gasp of air as he stared at what he'd done. All these people were fighting. They have families too. People who love them. I killed 5 soldiers today, Zhang. 6 now. I've resorted to killing my own squad. I think I'm becoming him. I wanted so badly to tell Gyeon it was okay, that it wasn't his fault. But I couldn't. I don't know why, but I just couldn't. I looked down at Sok Jo's bloody corpse, and I know I should have felt the sense of remorse, like I had for Hyun Wook, but for some reason I didn't. Staring at the dead body made me almost satisfied in a way. I crouched down and began repiling the rocks for the fire pit. The planes had stopped flying overhead, and for the first time that day, there was absolute silence. We had finished the fire pit long before Sergeant Ji, Tae, and Sok Ho came back. They eventually materialized from the landscape, as if emerging from the trees themselves. And I noticed 2 things right away. The first detail I noticed was that Ji was the only one carrying firewood. Tae was empty-handed, and the second was that Sok Ho wasn't with them. Gin and I held our breaths as they approached. Ji arrived at the pit and dropped his bundle of logs. Tae soon joined him and sat opposite of Gyan and me. It was then that he noticed the corpse of Sok Jo laying off to the side. He peered at it for a moment, then turned and stared directly at Gyan. I don't know how he knew it. I didn't have time to wonder how, because the next thing that he did was walk up to me and hand me his gun. He didn't even have to speak. I knew what he wanted me to do. Gyeon knew what he wanted me to do, and Tae did nothing but stare. I took the T-38 and held it in my hands. It was strange to be holding the weapon. It emanated an aura of death, almost as if it was cursed, but I had to admit it felt solid and weighty in my possession. I stood up and looked into the distance, in the direction of the battlements from where we'd first come. I wondered if this is what it felt like to have power in life, to decide the fate of others. I wondered if my father felt this too, and I wondered if he felt it when he beat me, or rubbed my face in his shit, or forced me to watch him rape my mother. I turned to look at Gyen's pleading expression. All the rage, all the torture, all the pain I'd put up with throughout my life had culminated in that single moment. I looked at Sergeant Ji and saw my father. "If you say so, sir." And I pulled the trigger without hesitation. Blood splattered against the rocks. Where Jay's nose should have been was now a gaping hole, its flesh dripping from the inside, as if it were liquid. I lowered the rifle and let it fall from my grip, and listened to it sink slightly into the loamy soil. I should mention that I hadn't killed a single U.S. soldier in battle that day, and I just killed my own sergeant. The feeling that came over me was something extraordinary. There was a great pain, a searing, remorseful pang that felt like a stab in my heart. But accompanying it was almost a joyous sensation, a fantastic satisfaction that I had rid the world of everyone else's pain. I was unburdened, I was relieved, and I was happy. And then the feeling went away as I stared downwards and realized what I had done. I dropped to my knees in shock. I couldn't speak. I couldn't think. I could only look at my calloused hands and cry. "Don't cry, soldier." I looked up, expecting to face a conversation from Gyan. But the voice was Tae's. The son of the deceased sergeant stood up and lit a match with his fingernail, tossing it into the pit and igniting the tinder. "There is no need to feel regret over anything that happened today." I looked over to Gyan, expecting the same astonished reaction that I'd had, but he was staring forward, focusing on something unseen behind Tae. War is a concept that warrants the taking of life. We kill because we see it as right. The dead did not deserve their lives. And out of my periphery, I saw Gyan reach for a pile of guns that lay behind us. But killing is so much more than that. I could hear Gyan grabbing one of the rifles from the pile. Killing is necessary for survival. Ironic, isn't it? I heard the fumbling of bullets being loaded into the rifle. But not only that, killing is the only punishment people will truly learn from. It's an ultimate expression of dominance. The magazine of the rifle clicked into place. And killing is merciful for both the victim and the one holding the gun. Gyan stood up and loaded a bullet into the chamber of his T-99. "What the fuck are you talking about, Tae?" he hissed. I detected a hint of apprehension in his voice. "I think you, of all people, know what I'm talking about, Gyan," he responded. He smiled. The fire crackled beneath him. I turned to look at Gyan, whose expression had morphed into a mixture of horror and remorse. Killing releases the monsters inside all of us. The fires suddenly bloomed into a full blaze, illuminating Tae's perfectly black eyes, his glistening pointed teeth, his unnatural green veins poking through his skin. And without hesitation, Gyan turned the rifle towards his own face.
선생님, 저는 이겨서 할 수 없습니다.
"If you say so, sir." And with that, he pulled the trigger. Tae, or whatever had taken on the form of Tae, disappeared into the woods before Gyan's body even hit the ground. I buried him next to Sok Jo and the sergeant, to the left of the fire pit. I watched as the sun rose above the trees, and my eyes followed a single green leaf that had fallen from above. It whistled its way down until it touched the diminishing flames of the fire and began to curl up. A plane flew overhead, the first of the day, and a mortar dropped somewhere back towards the battlements. I left all my equipment there and simply started hiking in a straight line, away from that place, away from whatever was controlling us. I don't know where it went, I don't know if it's still there, and I don't care. Eventually, I reached civilization and was able to retreat to the US-occupied South, where my English was put to good use. I may not be as deserving of the title of veteran as other people. I fought in the Korean War for a day, but I fought in Korea all my life, and since then, I've never stopped fighting. War-torn. 4 men wandered the woods of Vietnam, all armed with M16 rifles. The group of men were of Australian origin and were very proud to serve their country, even more proud of their mission to bring peace to Vietnam. Although armed with M16s, the 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment were resolved to only use them as a last resort. The 3rd Battalion were to merely patrol and search villages without destroying them, and to attempt to convert the villagers through peaceful means. This band of 4 comprised of 22-year-old Private Hayden Edwards, who was quite the stout but well-groomed fellow with a thick Australian accent, 19-year-old Private Finn Lucas, who was tall, thin, and wiry, with an ever-present 5 o'clock shadow, 21-year-old Corporal Frank Dillon, who was average stature and typical level-headed, quiet, and reserved, and last but not least was 25-year-old Sergeant Bailey McElroy, who was humble and could be mistaken for a bodybuilder due to how fit he was. The band brothers walked single file with Sergeant Bailey McElroy leading the group. The woods creaked eerily as the group walked, and Finn felt as if he were being watched, which made him nervous. "Is this the last village before we head back to camp and meet up with the rest of the 3rd Battalion, Sarge? 'Cause, I'm getting pretty hungry," Finn Lucas said in a hushed voice, trying to calm himself. Bailey McElroy opened his mouth to reply, but shut it when Hayden Edwards spoke first. "Same here, Finn. I don't understand why we don't just bomb the Northerners with chemicals. It'd save us a whole lot of fighting, and we at least be home eating right about now." Bailey shook his head as he trudged on through the woods, which were becoming more and more scarce as he advanced. "That's enough. Wait, didn't there used to be foliage here?" Sure enough, the area ahead of them was bare. "Yeah, there definitely was," replied Frank Dillon. A sense of unease took Finn as his mind tried to provide a solution for what could have destroyed the woods. "Surely the Yanks didn't use..." Frank began, but paused out of shock when he saw the village. A dozen bodies of various ages, sizes, and sex lay on the ground. All of the bodies were bald, red, and blistered. It was as if the fires of hell had swept through the village itself. Arguably, they had. "Agent Orange," Bailey stated with contempt in his voice. He unknowingly finished the sentence that Frank had started. Finn's stomach turned and the contents of his last meal were at stake. As they tried to exit his mouth, he managed to fight it back down. "Oh God, we're being exposed to this stuff. Are we going to end up like them?" Finn managed with a shaky voice, but Bailey shook his head. "No, not unless they use more. We're going to split into 2 groups and search for survivors. Finn, I want you with Frank. Hayden, you follow me." Finn and Frank happened upon a small and ominous shack. Finn wasn't sure why, but he had the distinct feeling that something alive lurked inside. Finn slowly pushed open the door and cautiously stuck his head inside, hoping that whatever was present wasn't sinister and didn't take his head off. A bald, red, blistering woman was laying on a bed. She was nude and alone, and she was giving birth. "Oh my God, go get Sarge," Finn managed to Frank. Frank bolted out of the humble little shack, calling out for Edwards and McElroy. Hayden and Bailey peeked out of the shack they had just searched. They ran to Frank after they saw that the coast was all clear. "Where's Finn?" Bailey asked in a panicked tone. "He's fine, Sergeant. Finn's with a survivor, but she's giving birth," Frank replied with a combination of worry and excitement ebbing out of his voice. "God help me. I'm only 19, Finn muttered to himself as he coached the crowning woman. "Come on, push. Push. Push harder." A head and shoulders popped out. The skin was normal and not blistered or red as Finn had feared it would be. Finn gently grabbed the baby's shoulders and began to pull. The door to the shack opened, and Frank, Bailey, and Hayden entered just in time to see the rest of the baby come out. The torso slid right on out, followed by another set of shoulders and a head. Finn tearfully and carefully handed the fused, deceased baby to its mother. Both tears and hatred filled the woman's eyes as she looked up at Finn. Her mouth opened as to say something, but the words never came. Finn reached down with his hands trembling and closed the dead woman's eyes. Although the woman hadn't spoke, Finn knew that she had blamed him and the company he kept for the Agent Orange. They did not sit well with Finn, who let tears flow forth from his eyes. The four men stood there giving the deceased a moment of respectful silence. Bailey eventually broke the silence when he turned to Hayden. "This is why we don't bomb anyone until they surrender." Hayden nodded in understanding as he wiped away a couple of tears. Rain fell from the sky as the men exited the shack. It was as if the sky was weeping too. The group hurried back toward camp in the hopes of getting out of the rain and receiving hot meals. And those hopes were dashed for Sergeant Bailey McElroy, who was struck down by a loud but unseen assailant. A bullet. A bullet entered and exited through Bailey's neck. An ambush that consisted of 7 well-armed North Vietnamese had made it behind the Australians. Unbeknownst to the band that was once 4 but now 3, the Vietnamese had seen them leaving the village and had assumed that they were responsible for its destruction by Agent Orange. "Bailey?" Finn exclaimed in a panic as he saw his comrade hit the mud with blood splurting from his neck. "There's nothing we could do for him, Finn. We need to hightail it back to camp or we're going to get slaughtered," Frank shouted over the gunfire. The 3 raced for camp and their lives. Edwards had a considerable lead, followed by Lucas and then Dillon. The men hadn't made it far from where Bailey had died when Frank Dillon's right foot landed on a mine. The landmine exploded, tearing through and incinerating Frank's right leg as it spat shrapnel in all directions. Shrapnel from the landmine struck Finn square in the back, causing him to fall to the ground in pain. Hayden turned around upon hearing the explosions and saw his comrade's predicament. Finn picked himself up off the ground, trying to ignore the pain and pieces of shrapnel in his back as he advanced to Frank while firing his M16 wildly. Hayden followed Finn's example and doubled back toward Frank while firing his M16 at the North Vietnamese as well. 2 of the Vietnamese were hit by the random spray of bullets, which caused the rest to back off and seek cover. Finn and Hayden took advantage of the ceasefire and helped Frank to his leg. "Frank, can you use your gun as a crutch?" Hayden asked. Frank's response was nothing more than a series of pained wails. "Don't be daft, Hayden. He's going to bleed out if we don't get him back to camp quick," Finn replied. Hayden reached into his left pant pocket and pulled out a handkerchief. "Hayden, that's not going to work." "Well, it's better than nothing. It ought to slow it down." Hayden quickly wrapped the handkerchief around Frank's stump and tied it off. And no sooner had Hayden finished when the firing resumed. Finn dropped his M16 in favor of Frank and slung him over his shoulder as he began to travel back to camp as fast as he possibly could, while Hayden laid down more oppressive fire. Every step was grueling for Finn. Every step felt as if it would be his last. Finn, Hayden, and Frank's struggle bore fruit as the camp came into view, but the fruit became forbidden for Finn as a bullet struck him in the head, causing him to collapse and drop Frank. Darkness approached, and despite Finn's best efforts to fight it off, he blacked out. "And that's how I lost my ear and got discharged, Doc." The thin, bald glasses-wearing therapist nodded and cupped his chin as the 64-year-old veteran of Vietnam, Finn Lucas, finished his tale. The therapist, Troy Lawton, had a long history of providing a listening ear for war veterans. "Did Frank survive?" inquired Troy Lawton. Finn scratched his patchy white beard in thought. "Well, it's hard to say, Doc. I mean, he didn't bleed out and he got discharged, but he's a completely different man. He spent most of his time in Vietnam kicking back tinnies. I'd argue that the Frank Dillon I knew died the moment he kicked that landmine. But then I'd say that no one that participated in Vietnam survived. We all suffered and lost one thing or another, sometimes multiple. And what about Private Edwards? Finn shook his head. I have no idea. When I was blacked out, the rest of the 3rd Battalion came out of the camp due to having heard the commotion, and they repelled the Vietnamese away. And during that period of time, Hayden got hit and dragged off. Whether the bullet killed him, he lives, or was tortured and freed or executed, I don't know. Hayden was never found and is MIA to this very day. The two men sat in silence for a couple of moments as Troy Lawton digested what he had been told. The only sound that could be heard was the ticking of the grandfather clock. Have your sleeping habits improved? Troy finally asked, breaking the silence. No, I still don't get much. Maybe 4 hours. I hear rifles without fail when I shut my eyes. Rainy nights are particularly bad, but, thunder's just the worst. I take that back now. News, choppers, any choppers are. Every time I hear a chopper, I automatically flinch and start to lift my M16 only to realize that it's not even there. You're not alone in that, Finn. Many who come back from deployment experience feelings similar to yours. So tell me, do you feel any hatred towards the Americans for using Agent Orange? Hatred? No. I was angry at their military for the longest period of time, years. I eventually came to realize that they weren't the monsters that I tried to make them out to be. Rather, they're just people who made poor decisions. Granted, that particular poor decision had consequences far more serious than most poor decisions. Alarm went off, signaling that the therapy session was over. Well, I guess our time is already up. Will I be seeing you again, Mr. Lucas? I know you've had trouble finding a therapist that you found satisfactory over the years, but yeah, Doc, I'll give you a few more sessions to see if you could heal me. Finn cut him off as he lifted himself out of his seat. Finn made his way across the room, put his hand on the doorknob, and paused. Is something wrong, Finn? That incident with Agent Orange was 45 years ago. And that just got me thinking about what sort of weapons must exist now. Finn opened the door and walked out. Eclipse of War. What you all need to know about me is that my name is James Kincaid, and that this experience still haunts me to this day. The story comes from around 2004, and I was planning on publishing a collection of stories from the Great War, and had collected a fair amount of stories to use. They were what you would expect: loss of friends, tragedy, and the brutality of war. However, one of those stories stood out. The story came from an officer who served during the Great War. His name was Alexander Thompson. He didn't send me the story. Instead, he asked me to come and meet him in person. At the time, he was at least 110 years old. He greeted me, and his carer introduced us and proceeded to leave us alone. His friendly demeanor continued even though I could see the sadness in his eyes. He continued to swirl his military canteen that he drank his whiskey out of. I asked him about the story he had for me, and I noticed he was deeply afraid of that question. From this point on, everything I'm going to tell you is exactly what he told me, word for word. I spent most of my time in my trench. We received orders from the commander, and we were told that in about a week we would be going over the top. The rest of that day was mundane for us, save for a new recruit, of course. This new recruit went by the name of James Collins. He was a good kid. I could tell he trusted me because he continued to try and talk to me. I eventually managed to get some time alone, as we needed to get some sleep. As I slept, I found myself in my trench. It was almost completely dark. I saw the entire land was illuminated only by a lunar eclipse. No stars, no other lights of any kind. I headed toward the other side of the trench, and I heard a strange noise. It was at this point that Alexander hesitated to continue. I could see he was holding back tears. I gave him the option to stop, but he informed me that he needed someone to know his story. There was only one other soldier in the trench. It was another me. He looked exactly as I did, right down to his uniform. He asked me whether I knew what war will turn humanity into. And before I even had the chance to answer his question, large spikes began protruding from its back, and its hands morphed into razor-sharp claws. Despite those spikes and claws puncturing the flesh of that creature, it gave no indication that it was in pain. Most troubling of all, it continued to use my face, even though its body had deformed into a severely impaled humanoid figure. I quickly shot awake. McCollins was standing over me. He looked incredibly concerned and asked what was wrong. I told him that he shouldn't be too worried because it was just a nightmare, and there were more important things to be afraid of. It was then that a large explosion sounded just outside our trench. I rushed outside of the sleeping quarters to find that the Germans were shelling our trench again. I shouted for McCollins to keep low and to follow me. When the shelling stopped, we assessed the damage. Thankfully, there were minimal casualties, but McCollins was still fairly shaken up from the experience. After the seemingly endless bombardment, McCollins pointed out something peculiar. There was a message written in the sandbag. I can't remember what it said exactly, but it was along the lines of this. He handed me an old ripped open envelope. Written on it were the words, "You will know soon enough." Now, despite how odd the message seemed, we brushed it off as a joke, or as a message intended for somebody else. However, we couldn't shake that uneasy feeling that the message had given us, so we decided it would be best to try and forget about it. A few days passed, and I'd keep seeing that creature in my dreams. It wouldn't attack me because it wanted to observe me. I eventually started to refer to it as Eclipse. This was due to the fact that in every dream it appeared in, the night sky was lit up by a lunar eclipse. Things changed on the last night before we went over the top. I was standing in an empty white nothingness with Eclipse. It told me that today I would learn what war truly does to a man, and that he and I had a deeper connection than I had imagined. And when I asked what he meant by this, he walked off saying one word: McCollins. The next day we were ordered to go over to the top. I charged alongside McCollins to the other trench, but the bullets and explosions separated us from the rest of our battalion, and we found ourselves in the forest. This wouldn't have been so bad if it wasn't for the long scratch marks we found in a tree, and the unholy sight of Eclipse staring at the two of us. I turned to ask McCollins if he had seen the creature, but instead, nobody stood beside me. That faithful boy under my command had seemingly abandoned me. I then heard him calling for me deeper into the woods. I continued searching for McCollins. Instead, I only found Eclipse. It started to chase me out of the forest, and I ran until I was out of breath. I turned to see the creature charging towards me, and I raised my rifle and I aimed at the creature. And as I pulled the trigger, I closed my eyes slowly in fear of what was to come. The loud bang of a gunshot and then nothing but silence. As I reopened my eyes, I found that Eclipse had vanished, and McCollins lay there on the ground. The bullet had punctured his lung, and I could tell that he was dying. I tried desperately to save him, and I looked at my reflection rather than tending to my wounded friend. It smeared his blood on its face and said with a taunting smirk, "My work is done." After hearing his story, I didn't know what to say, but it was what Alex said next that disturbed me even more. "I've learned what war does to a man, and one day you will too." I left his home after hearing his story. I got in my car. I drove home as quickly as possible. When I arrived, I took a moment to contemplate what Alex had told me. I got out of the car and walked over to my house, and I noticed something scratched into the side of my car. It sent a chill down my spine. Scratched into the side of my car was a simple message that I knew was intended for me. And that message read, "I am no dream."